Welcome, those of you at the CRC Roundtable. As you can tell, we're doing something a little bit different. We're basically coming to you live from the Chesapeake Research Symposium. And so we just had a pretty amazing morning about panels, so everybody's pretty excited, and it might be a little noisy as they go get lunch and come back in. So let me start. Welcome to the 20-something CRC Roundtable. If you haven't been with us before, this is a monthly virtual seminar series. Our intention has always been to host targeted, inclusive, and informed conversations that match scientific advances and management needs. These webinars are designed for contribution, not consumption. And so each seminar invites a range of research managers and other professionals to have conversations around critical topics in order to build connectivity and increase our collective competency. As a reflection of that intent, the panelists have been given about 25 minutes total to make some introductory remarks, allowing 30 minutes for discussion. And this is all about us, giving a place to ask the clumsy questions, to practice the bravery and humility necessary for building the future that we want. We always start these webinars with an answer to the questions, why this topic at this time by these speakers. I really thank our panelists. This is not your normal roundtable, as you can see. And so really thanks for participating wholeheartedly in the experiment of live streaming a roundtable. Participatory community science, I think, is a really fitting topic during a time when unnecessary divisions between those with a voice and those without have never been starker. And I've long admired the field of astronomy, where the significance of contributions, whether by volunteers or professionals, are viewed simply as valuable contributions, one no less than the other. Community science is more than just a feel-good way of getting the general public involved in science. There are critical uncertainties in Chesapeake Bay restoration that can be addressed by involving volunteers. And in addition, that community science can give back to those lending a hand in their communities. By striving for a two-way exchange and involving diverse community members around the Bay, we can theoretically make a big difference in the restoration efforts. As for the speakers, the two programs represented here, I think, represent the best dimensions of participatory science. Its potential utility as a source of data, as a critical educational experience for the next generation of professionals, and as a powerful engagement tool. I apologize, I'll do a short version of bios because I think people can find them online and I think people really want to hear talk. I will just say that we have Allison Kaywood. I think she's going to start. She's the Director of Public Engagement for Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, and she coordinates its citizen science programs. Julie Vastine is the Director of the Alliance for Aquatic Resource Monitoring, which is new to me, at Dickinson College in Carlisle. And she does a tremendous amount to provide technical assistance to watershed communities using science as a tool for change. I also like, at the end of her bio, she does her watershed address, which is really a wonderful idea. So with that, the general rule is we'll take the first 25 minutes to hear the panelists make their remarks. Then we open it up for facilitated conversation, both from here and on the online chat. So Allison, you want to come up, and I will maybe move this up to the side. So can't seem to get to yeah, I know. I'm trying to get to oh, PowerPoint. Can we show oh, there we go. All right.
Hi, everybody. Like Denise said, my name is Allison, and I'm gonna, I was asked today to just kind of give a general overview about what this is and kind of what this means, at least to me, and I'm happy to talk about it because there's some pieces of this that definitely deserve some conversation. So to start with, I would ask you to just close your eyes for a second and think about what does a scientist do. This is not exactly the best audience for this, but we're gonna go with it anyway. All right, so when you search scientist on Google, these are the pictures that you get. These are the first ones that come up that are free to that have a free license, okay? So, you get these like flaming, glowing test tubes and people in white coats, right? That's never the kind of science that I've done. The science that I do looks like this. This is always the kind of science that I've done, right? And so as many of you are involved in environmental science know, a lot of environmental science isn't super tricky stuff. We count stuff, we measure stuff, we might just look at where some things are, right? It's not super tricky stuff. And so because of that, there's a lot of amazing ways to involve people in the work that you do. So I'm going to use the word citizen science here, and I'm happy to talk about the vocabulary. Is a really interesting conversation in itself. But the way that we talk about that at CERC is this is the participation of volunteers in original scientific research. In the US, the word citizen can be a little charged and exclusionary. So there have been some pushes to change some of that vocabulary. There's long been a lot of words to describe this, right? I've pulled a few of them and put them up here. There are challenges and pros and cons to all of these words, but I'm happy to discuss that further in the conversation. But I'm going to probably go with, I like Denise's participatory science is one of the words that I prefer, so that's probably what I'm gonna go with for the rest of the talk. But whatever terms you want to use, it's science. Just with volunteers. It's not science education. It's not data collection where you already know the answer. It's not data collection where you're going to stick things in a drawer and never have anybody look at them, right? It's science. But because of who is involved in it for this purpose, it tends to get defined by who does it rather than the outcomes of it, and it's also not a new idea. This is not a brand new thing. A couple of examples. The oldest one I know of is an 1833 meteor shower, where there was a researcher from Yale who put ads in papers all over the United States and had people respond to him about when and where they had seen this meteor shower. And he was able to map this across the country using newspaper results. The origins of physical oceanography were from reports that were made by sailors and watermen who were out on the water, and they started being collected in one place, actually at the Naval Academy, and it started the Office of Naval Research was all driven by volunteer collected data, stakeholder data. There was a series of lighthouse surveys that started the Audubon Society back in the 1880s, where they had lighthouse keepers who were they were looking at bird strikes, actually, because it was what was hitting the lighthouses and causing damage. But then it turned out you could also use that not only to build lighthouses in better ways that cause less damage, but also tell you a lot about what birds were there and how that was changing and what that looked like. So this is not a new idea, right? So back into the early 1800s, people have been doing this work, but we haven't always recognized that or acknowledged the value of that. And just as one of my favorite examples of this, there was a study by Karen Cooper and her colleagues a few years ago that she looked at a meta-analysis paper that was looking at bird migration and climate change. And this paper cited 173 studies, and 84 of those studies were based on volunteer collected data. But more than half of those in the original paper didn't mention volunteers anywhere. It was just, you had to know that that data source was eBird, or that data source was something like that, where you know those data are pulled from volunteers. There was no mention of volunteers in this work. So these are some of the big ideas in this field that volunteers have contributed hugely to, right? They're doing more than half of the papers that were cited in this work included volunteers, and there was no acknowledgement of that fact. The projects that involve participatory science are incredibly diverse. They cover a huge range of topics, from astronomy to earth science and public health. They can be place-based, so they can be things where you have to be in this place at this time to observe this thing. There's some great local examples. The horseshoe crab surveys that go in Delaware Bay have been going for a long time. There's a cricket crawl. There are a ton of stream monitoring groups, as this group is very well aware, and Julie's going to speak to you some more. They can aggregate data from lots of places. So these are things like the Audubon bird, the Christmas bird counts, if anyone's ever been part of those, that happen all over the country and have been happening for over 100 years. And it's this amazing snapshot of data that gets pulled together that's been able to use to track a lot of these changes. Or they can occur completely remotely. There are projects that are done that are analysis of images, that can be an analysis of text, and these things that are happening on computers that allow anybody anywhere in the world to participate and be part of this work. They can be super low involvement and easy. There are things where you can just take a picture and you're done, or you swab the belly button swab was part of a human biome study, and they had people swab their belly buttons and send in the, the Q-tips, and you like got a huge amount of information about how microbiomes differ. There's a fantastic study that was done in California where they had a wildfire that had gone through a public park, and they set up just L brackets on a post and asked people to take pictures and use a Twitter hashtag. And then you were able to track the recovery from this forest fire through time. So, and that's just somebody who happened to be walking along, right? They didn't have to know anything special, but they could contribute this data that was really valuable. Or they can be super high involvement, where the volunteers who are part of these projects have received a ton of training and are experts in what they do. So like, I think we tend to think of like volunteers as, you know, maybe high school students or something, and those are there, right? Like I work with those people all the time. But we also have volunteers at CERC who are retired physical chemists or retired NASA engineers, right? We have these people who come to us with amazing skill sets and all kinds of knowledge, and some who come to us without that, but are willing to learn and are willing to put in the effort to become experts in these things. And they can do some of this work that requires really high levels of training and time and expertise to be involved in. So, you know, I get a microphone, so you guys get to hear a little bit of some of the things that I think are really important for people who aren't involved in this work, but like the idea of it, because there are things that aren't always obvious and I think are taken for granted a bit. It's not a cheaper, easier way to do science. This is from some work that Monica is going to actually present about later, where we had a project that we started. It started with doing a staff-based project with a few volunteers being involved, and transitioned to being one that is run the vast majority of data collection and the first step of the data processing are done by volunteers. And oh, you cannot see all of that thing. Okay. Over this 5-year period where we changed this, we had this huge increase in the amount of staff time that had to go into running this project and the amount that this project cost. It was not a cheaper, easier way. Sometimes there's this assumption that because you're going to have these extra people involved, that's going to make it cheaper and easier. But you have to deal with the people then. The things you're doing might change, but it doesn't make it less work. When you involve volunteers in the work that you do, everything has to be ready to go and it has to work. A lot of times scientists, especially those who work in the field, aren't super big on that, right? Like you're going to figure it out as you go, and you're going to have like decisions that you make on the fly and depend on conditions. And when that's just you, that's great. You can do that. That is perfectly acceptable. When you're doing this with people who don't have that same basis, and you're doing this with people who you want the data collection to be standard, and you don't want each of them to be making their own decisions individually about like, is this the right way to do this, right? You can't have that. It has to work. You have to know that it works. You have to have tested it so many times in so many situations, and it's still going to not be all the way. They're still going to find all the ways that it doesn't work that you still have to fix, but you know, that's okay too. So it's more organization. It's a different kind of work, but it's not less work. It doesn't really work to just plug volunteers into existing projects. I mean, with 1 or 2 volunteers, sometimes you can, but there are some people sometimes people will try to say like, okay, we're going to take this project we've been doing this way for a long time, and we're just going to like make it a participatory science project. We'll just ask people to be part of that. And it doesn't work super well. The same project, this is our Chesapeake Bay parasite project, where we did this comparison from when it was, a more traditional project or participatory science project. We had to change the sites because you have to worry about things like parking and bathrooms and like whether there's going to be enough shade to have a group of 20 people outside, right? It's going to be a whole different thing. There are things you have to consider and think about that you don't have to with what you're going to do. You have to think about when people will show up and what they're willing to do when they show up. So it doesn't really just work to trade one for the other. The other is that volunteers aren't a monolith. When you're talking about volunteers and you're talking about volunteer projects, that can look like so many different things. It can look like high school students, and that's great. And I love working with high school students. But it can also look like a corporate group. It can look like somebody who is retired as a high school vice principal and looking to get involved in science and wants to show up 3 or 4 days a week and do science. It looks like so many different things, and why people show up and what they want to get out of the experience matters. And you have to think about that when you're designing your project and when you're recruiting your volunteers, because what you need to be able to meet their expectations and to be able to meet their motivations and why they show up to work with you. And not all projects are going to work for everybody, and that's okay. That's not a bad thing. Same as you wouldn't use the same techniques and you wouldn't ask the same questions if you were studying, a wetland in Chesapeake Bay and a rocky shore in New England, right? It's a different system. It's different, and that's okay. It's the same thing with the groups of volunteers. It's not a monolith. They're going to be different people who need different things, and different projects can be designed for different groups, and that's okay. It's not a bad thing. This is my last kind of little bit of a rant. This is one that comes up for people when this is new. Data quality is important, and people worry a lot about data quality when you start engaging volunteers in the research process. It is so important to have good data quality procedures, data assurance procedures, but that's important no matter what kind of science you do. It doesn't magically become important when you have volunteers collecting that data. Many of us have long worked with undergraduate interns I have volunteers who are much more experienced than some of our interns when they start, right? That doesn't mean that they can't be taught. That doesn't mean they can't collect good data, but you need to have checks in place, but you need to do that always. It's not a magic thing that just shows up because volunteers are part of your process. Okay, that's all I have to say. I'm gonna turn it over to Julie.
Get that out of your way.
Should have been. I don't like that sound. Ah. What? Oh. Just.
All right. Always fun technology and sounds that come from computers. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having Allison and I here to talk to you about community-based or participatory science. It's great to be able to have this conversation with the Chesapeake Research Consortium. So thank you so much for having me. So Allison did a fantastic job of taking a look at the field as a whole, giving some examples. And what I'm going to do is bring us a little bit more specifically into the water monitoring field. I have the privilege of serving as the aquatic citizen science representative or volunteer monitoring representative to the National Water Quality Monitoring Council. And so that allows me to engage with volunteer programs all throughout the country. And there's a lot of fantastic work that is being done. A little bit about me, since some of you may not have heard of Dickinson College's Alliance for Aquatic Resource Monitoring. First off, we're giving a presentation later this afternoon. So I'm here with my colleague, Phoebe Gallium. So please check that out. It's in the 3:20, 3:40 time slot. But we're a 36-year-old community science center at Dickinson College. And for the entirety of our mission as an organization, we have worked with Pennsylvania and New York residents in helping volunteers answer and address questions about stream health and water quality in their backyard. So throughout our 36-year history, we have used a diverse models of approaches and engagement in carrying out that mission. And so we've touched on lots of different water quality issues, from acid rain to shale gas to baseline water quality monitoring. We are housed at Dickinson College and full-time, part-time staff, and we also get to employ students as well, which is fantastic. Some of whom I believe are listening in. Hi, Michelle and Charlotte. So let's take a look at a couple of things here. So as we all know about the Clean Water Act, and it was passed in 1972. But something that you may or may not have realized, my own personal favorite aspect of the Clean Water Act, is the 1987 amendment, which states that, I'm not going to read this verbatim, but as data are being assembled for the Clean Water Act reports, it opened the doors for data to be submitted from members of the public and academic institutions. And so that really helped to open the door for community collected data. And at that time, once that happened with the Clean Water Act, the Environmental Protection Agency, along with a number of federal agencies, started to develop some standard materials to help guide and facilitate water quality monitoring programs that could help support data collection efforts and make sure we have some of those best practices in place. So there's lots of different components of a successful program. We're a research consortium, so we know the ingredients that make our research strong. The same is absolutely true for community collected data. And for us, that always starts with the study design. Study design was mentioned during our opening panel of, we need to ask those questions, think about the data that we're gonna need at the outset of a project. And of course, you have to do that with community collected data as well. You also have your quality assurance project plans, your different data credibility measures, your standard operating procedures, and you also need to have, getting and just underscoring Allison's point, you also need to understand the base that you're working with and have your volunteer engagement strategy, and making sure that you have the tools to recruit, train, certify, and retain your volunteers. And of course, always evaluate and assess your programs. So we always start with study design as a 10-step process to work with a community partner or a base of volunteers to see what is the question that folks are most interested in answering, and then make sure that we define the scope, answer the who, what, where's, whys of their monitoring program, define the credibility, identify the roles, and this happens before monitoring or any data collection takes place. I have a couple of different data collection mantras, and some of you might be new to the field of community science or participatory science. And the first is, all data of known quality have use. And when I mean known quality, we're going to talk about metadata in a hot little second. But yes, we need to have that key information about the data that are collected, and every data point has the potential for use. The other thing that is equally important and directly connected is you have to match the intended goals and the use of those data with the quality of data collected. So making sure that you're matching the technique to that intended use. And that we can get into examples during the Q&A. The other thing that often comes about, and EPA has its own version of this, I'm pulling it from the original source, which is Jeff Dates, who was with River Network back in 2001. But as you look at the continuum of data use, as you make that transition from education to awareness, oh, hello, Google Slides, and altering my text, to assess impairment and then legal and regulatory, you're going to expect that increase in time, quality assurance, rigor, and expense being associated with those techniques. So again, there's lots of different water quality monitoring approaches all throughout the Chesapeake Bay. And there's lots of different models of which these things take place. You can have hybrid approaches with folks getting field measurements, getting samples sent to to labs. You can have folks that are doing all field measurements. There's lots of different ways that data can be collected in this field, from discrete to continuous. And we always say, you know, as you're working with volunteers, and this I think is true in every program, there's always that space for ingenuity. And volunteers are always thinking through ways to increase like their own experience. We have some DIY measures up here with a floater that one of our volunteers made for gathering their temperature in the really cold months when the meters move a little bit slower. We had someone create a meter stand. Shout out to Don Albright. You know, it's just a lot of great ways that folks take their volunteer experience, dial in, and take it to the next level. And you absolutely need to connect to what Allison said earlier. These programs are cost effective, but not cost free. So want to give a couple of examples as I come into my final minutes here of things to be thinking about with data quality and using cost-effective equipment or low-cost equipment. One is not all equipment is created equal. One of the things that the Alliance for Aquatic Resource Monitoring does for our field is to do equipment testing, seeing how that compares to techniques with more refined sensitivity. So for example, not all nutrient techniques are created equal. So that's a space in which we do a lot of testing to make sure we're making the right recommendation. There's other ways that you can maximize data quality. So if you are going to be doing nutrient testing with volunteers, you know, you go to your book of standard methods. We want to make sure that we're aligning the volunteer practices with what the prescribed suggestions and techniques are with that. So look at those holding times, look at those replicates, thinking about your storage techniques. And also for our volunteers, they acid wash their glassware. That's what standard method requires. So, you know, there's lots of ways that you can increase the quality of data collected. And then again, metadata, that point of all data of known quality have use. So making sure that you not only have really great data sheets, but also working with your database developers to make sure that every data point has the corresponding metadata to help the data user make the decision of how they'd like to use the data. And shout out to the Chesapeake Data Explorer for the behind the scenes look here. We're a part of the Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative Alarm and we get to work with volunteers and non-traditional partners throughout the Chesapeake Bay. Watershed Alarm is the Pennsylvania, New York partner, and we also collaborate with the Alliance for Chesapeake Bay, Isaac Long League of America, University of Maryland, Center for Environmental Science, and of course the Bay program. And the central goal of CMC is to help integrate the data that are being collected throughout the watershed into a central repository of the Chesapeake Data Explorer, and also to help support new monitoring where we have those spatial temporal gaps. So these maps are from 6 years ago. So this blue map represents the Chesapeake Bay program monitoring sites. And at the outset of CMC, we did surveys out to over 660 community groups and non-traditional partners throughout the Bay watershed to be like, where are y'all monitoring? And when you add them into the map, you can see that we're increasing our spatial coverage throughout the watershed. And so through CMC, we've been adding to that, getting those sites into our central repository, the Chesapeake Data Explorer, which today has over 600,000 data points. So lots of great, a lot of great data in there. You can find the metadata and start exploring for yourselves how you'd like to use that and connect it to your own projects. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Denise for her questions. Or to Patrick.
Yeah, so I just wanted to recognize Patrick Neal, who's here from Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, that really, I believe, along with Allison, really put together this roundtable. So we're greatly appreciative. Did you want to ask the panel questions?
No, go ahead.
Okay. I'll just start off with a couple and then I will go ahead and moderate some from the chat. So those of you that are online, feel free to ask your questions in the chat. I'll take them out from there, but I had a couple to start. And I think in going on the last plenary panel. One of the questions is, how can participatory science projects address issues important to and involve people from diverse communities around the Bay and watershed? So if you each want to take a turn, and whoever wants to go first. Yeah.
So I think one of the models that's commonly used in participatory science is to go to where the community is. So that's a common question that we get with our work. There are a few people are like, we're 5.5 hours away from Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Do I need to come to you? And our philosophy is always, no, we're going to come to you. So I think it's important that we show up in the spaces and diverse spaces where folks are grappling with different water quality monitoring questions, honoring and engaging the sensitivities that are there, and making programs as accessible as possible for folks to come in and connect to the work that is being done. Essential step for that for us is in that study design phase where we can sit down with community partners and have a discussion about what are your central goals and objectives and concerns here. And as we're exploring that question, part of that also gets to what are the resources and limitations, and how do we need to leverage different efforts to make this project or this program more accessible. So I guess my first response to that is make sure that you're meeting communities where they are. Make sure that folks are helping to set the research agenda so that the questions being asked and answered are relevant and help address those real issues in post backyard. And if and whenever possible, leverage resources. So in our program, we have a significant equipment loan agreement program. It is very hard to stay on top of those expiring reagents, as our community science specialist Stephanie well knows. But that helps to, offset the cost of equipment is really important. And the other thing is recognizing that not everyone has the ability to donate their time to be a part of this project. So we also, thanks to the Campbell Foundation, have funds available to help support childcare costs, to help support scholarships to different programs, and things like that as well to help increase access to our programs.
Yeah, so I would say a lot of the points that were brought up in the previous panel are really applied here, right? That this is not a magic bullet. And participatory methods be a way to better engage communities, to better engage diverse stakeholders? Absolutely. But that takes a rethinking of how you do things. It's still really easy to do science in the same way and just add your volunteers in, right? Where we have this really traditional top-down structure where you have a PI who gets funding and you invite people to be part of your work. And there's nothing wrong with that. We do lots of that kind of stuff, right? That's an important piece. But if it's going to be inclusive and help to make science a more inclusive space and increase the number of voices that are part of that, we have to flip that model. You have to be willing to let other people ask questions, even if they're not the questions that maybe you would be most interested in. You have to be willing to approach things in ways that maybe aren't the most efficient or don't fit as well into kind of traditional models and traditional structures. So it really takes, like any of the other DEI work, right? Like it takes a commitment to that and to really being conscious about what the power dynamics look like, who is benefiting from the work that's being done, who is making the decisions about the work that's being done. It doesn't just magically go away when you put it in a participatory space.
Great. Any questions from here? Because I have some from here. So, all right, I have another one that really engages with the first plenary panel this morning, which are what critical uncertainties about progress of the restoration do you think could be answered well by participatory science, that it would really serve a dual purpose, right? That there would be this two-way exchange. So did any of what would be, maybe if you could have apply participatory science to a question that you think is particularly important at this point, what might that be?
So for me, I think it's anywhere where the methods can be straightforward enough, but you need much higher temporal resolution than you could get otherwise, which is a problem, that was pointed out by lots of these other projects, right? Where you have some of these modifications that have been there for a long time, but it's not comprehensive covered this day, right? It can be really hard to answer some of those questions if you don't have them. So those are the places where I think participatory techniques can really be the most benefit. And I think they can be two ways, right? Because if you're letting people collect data about the places that they are, the places that they care about, that's better for them. And hopefully you're building that structure in a way to have access to the data, that they can engage with those data, and the data are meaningful for them too. But I think those are the kinds of questions where this could be incredibly powerful for helping people address.
Just a couple of words, because actually I have to leave because I'm chairing the session after this. But we're talking about the applications of community science to the Chesapeake Bay restoration, and in particular looking at water quality. So the project that Alice and I involved in specifically are addressing that question. So those people that can, I would encourage you to come to the session after this.
I love the advertisements. Yes, and please come to the PD Galleon's presentation, because we'll specifically talk about one of our water monitoring programs and also how you engage volunteers in the data interpretation process. So that's like a whole nother topic, but I'll let PD discuss that later. But to get to your question, Denise, first of all, has anyone here ever opened or taken a look at the Chesapeake Bay Explorer? Well, we have the developers in the room, so that was the first hand would go up. Thank you, Karen. So when you think about those questions that we all have about the health of the Chesapeake Bay, and we think about those parameters that help us to understand, how are we making progress? Take a look at the Data Explorer. Our communities are collecting a lot of relevant parameters that are similar to the parameters that you might be collecting. So nutrients and temperature and pH, conductivity, bacteria, macroinvertebrates. Take a look at that because there's a lot of overlap with some of the parameters that we're interested in. But one, just want to amplify what Allison was saying about the role of volunteers and increasing spatial temporal coverage. I can tell lots of stories about that, but I'll just say that's a really good point there. And the other thing that happens as well is that you're able to increase the eyes, ears, and boots on the ground where these projects are taking place. The Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative has a new partnership with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, where we're looking at the role that volunteers can play in assessing the status of best management practices. And it's a list of 10 best management practices that are being implemented. And some of the things that were being talked about during the panel this morning, and we hear throughout the conversations going on over these couple of days, making sure that those best management practices are being installed and maintained properly are crucial to being able to have success with data progress and being able to increase boots on the ground at these projects, being able to take a look at the status of these projects, alerting folks to potential issues that might be there, in addition to capturing data about the relationship of these projects to the stream and geomorphology is critically important. So, there's a lot of spaces there's a lot of uncertainties, but there's a lot of diverse ways that we're trying to capture data and engage the different questions in the day.
Any questions from the floor? Bill, do we have a microphone?
No, we don't. Go ahead. Okay, I just had one comment. I know that Margaret and Mulholland had a really interesting program to get people on the ground. People taking photographs of how far the water rose during blue sky. But the more important kind of question is maybe could be addressed for lot of people out there who are looking at this question is, how do we participate if we live near the water? For example, I can imagine taking this measurements into my dock, and the end of docks all up and down the bay on a regular basis would be extremely useful information for the bay program to have as we get more and more privileges and visa. We could all be taking turbidity measurements in small areas. But I don't know how to encourage that idea or take measurements and provide or retraining. I'm not that researching that I know, but people need to be trained. So anyway,
Yeah. So one of the great things about Chesapeake Bay for that, and that's a bigger problem in lots of places, but in Chesapeake Bay, there are so many amazing existing volunteer monitors, right, that are either community-based or that are like the project that Pat and I are doing is really working with the River Super Network. This is Chesapeake Bay. There are 30 different river keepers that are in like the tidal portion of the bay. That's not even getting up to the into the freshwater portion of the bay of the watershed. And so there are these existing groups and these existing communities who are interested in this space, who have connections to these communities, and are willing and excited and care about the answers that are coming out of it. So sometimes it's just a matter of connecting with those groups and hoping to build that capacity, right? That, like, because like it's not hard measurement, but if you do it wrong, like right, like you can still screw it up. But it doesn't take a lot of people to do it correctly. It just takes a little bit of effort and connection to the people who want to do that. And so some of those existing organizations and connecting through those existing organizations is a really powerful way to do that. And connecting individuals is hard. It's not impossible, but it's a lot harder.
I have two responses to add on to what Allison said. One is there is a citizen science directory called sciencestarter.com. It's a place where you can search for different types of community science projects near you. So you can see if there's any community anatomic that is of interest to you. The other thing I would say is plug into your existing programs. So here we have the Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative. If there is a specific question that you have around water quality, you can submit that into our website and we respond to those requests monthly. So to help plug people to where they are. And if it's a question or a topic that's not within our skill set, most likely the coordinators are going to know of a similar program or a program that aligns with your interests, and we can get you connected to that as well. So those are 2 points I would say there.
I have well, 2 questions, I think. One is that to repeat what Bill said about marginal Holland's king tide sampling, is that provided incredible information, which was both the extent of flooding and then water samples, looking at actually the load that was coming. It wasn't accounted for. It's an unaccounted for load. Margie has since expressed difficulty in finding continued funding for that. So is there an obstacle about, obtaining funding for these efforts that are really well suited to participatory science?
Well, at the same time, efforts I don't know the person's affiliation, but if they're not connected with NOAA seed grant, I would definitely lose them in there. NOAA has series of funding that help with those science and monitoring projects, and NOAA seed grant is a great community interface to help us make those kinds of projects. But what you are seeing across the federal landscape is an increase in funding availability to support participatory science projects, especially as the infrastructure is being set up to help bring this data in and use in diverse ways. So from the National Science Foundation, EPA, to the Chesapeake Bay program, to so many other funders, there are pots of money that are available for service and significant sea science funding initiatives. So efforts are definitely out there, and specific to your colleagues' interests, maybe a conversation offline.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I completely agree with you that especially at the federal level. level, there is being more dedicated funding, and we're seeing more and more dedicated funding programs that are for science, which is a fantastic thing to see. Also, but I mean, I've heard grants that aren't through those, that if you can fund them through traditional funding mechanisms, I think part of the bigger challenge here is it's hard to fund them. Like regardless of who's doing that, it's really hard to make the fund, right? It's just part of the thing.
I think I'm gonna try and ask you one last question. And for those of you online, you can't imagine what the challenges that these panelists are navigating. All kinds of things are going on in their view space. And so again, I really, really appreciate it. Maybe if you want to each address the following question, what citizen science issue keeps you up at night? But then followed by, really, what's the one thing you want people to take away about the general issue of participatory science as they leave the room? So those two questions: what's the issue that keeps you up at night? But then also, what's the message that you want to leave?
So I'm going to take a slightly different angle on that question. The message I would love for everyone to take away from this discussion is thinking about how we can leverage the power of science in communities. We have the privilege of working with folks who are willing to donate their free time to collect scientific data. And we put all the tools there to help make sure that those data are the best possible data that can be collected with the equipment that they have access to. And what I ask of you is to please consider having a kind of open mind as you go to the Chesapeake Data Explorer. Take a look at the data. Take a look at the metadata. Take a look at our standard operating procedures and check out the quality of the data that are being collected by this amazing community throughout the Chesapeake watershed. There's a lot of incredible stories that can be found in those data sets, and you'll hear from me out later about some of those local stories that we're finding in our counties in Pennsylvania and in New York. And these data are useful in addressing our tax and our county lists. So I ask you to have an open mind and check out the Data Explorer and see how those data can help serve your projects.
And are you sleeping well at night?
Well, sure. This isn't what keeps me up. This is what fuels my passion and joy. So this is something that helps me sleep quite soundly.
Oh, great.
So the participatory science things that keep me up are, it's to the funding, right? Like we can do all of these things. There's so much amazing potential, but how to pay for that and how to organize all those things and do it in time to actually meet some of the really daunting environmental challenges that we're facing. So that's the thing that I'm worried about. As far as the thing to know, I kind of want to echo some of what Julie said. Participatory science is amazingly powerful and it's fun. If it's not something that you've done or engaged in the past, I would encourage you to reach out to someone who does and talk to them about it. It's a really good way to do science. It can change the way that you do science, and it lets you engage with these people who are passionate and excited about what you do and about helping you do the work that you do, which is this kind of excitement.
Well, I think we're going to wrap it up, and a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you for everyone who joined us online, and please take the post-event survey if you're online, and thanks again.